Hello class, we're looking at chapter 9. This is physical and cognitive development in middle and late childhood. It is a time of gradual, continual growth. Let me just get my notes up here. Be patient, guys. Slow, consistent change. Proximal distal pattern of growth is much more pronounced as our body becomes more proportional with our arms and legs. The brain. Look at the brain. Go here real quick. Total brain volume stabilizes by the end of middle-late childhood. Significant changes in brain structure occur, which we'll talk about a little bit later with the cognitive development and become more apparent. Motor development, they're just more coordinated, and so we'll see during this time they have greater skills. Physical skills or fine motor skills are improved. Fine motor skills being the fingers, gross motor skills being the big muscles. Exercise and sport PE program declines. It's a debate out there. Some schools will say, well, we need to make sure we're educating our children so they're more competitive, so the science and maths are taking precedence. But I think to the detriment of children, and the text kind of leans in that direction as well, with a thing called a metabolic syndrome. It's a constellation of factors we usually see in middle-aged adults with obesity, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, those type things. And now we're seeing that in these young kids. I talked about it a couple chapters ago. And so what's happening is that we're seeing these cardiovascular disease that usually is not into their 50s or 60s being seen in kids in this age range. While it's not common, it's also becoming more prevalent. Health, illness, and disease, accident injuries are the major cause of death. They're the leading cause, with certainly motor vehicle accidents being the primary one. But they throw in accidents because they're much more, again, they're doing more tasks. They're riding bicycles, skateboarding, those type of things. Obesity is a big concern. The greatest risk factor of being overweight at age 9 was having a parent who was overweight. So typically, the reason why we see this is there's a shift in our society to less physical activity and high-calorie diets, with fast foods being just so prevalent. Again, cardiovascular disease is a concern. Cancer, second leading cause of death. Again, it's those like blood-borne type cancers that we see. The text begins to look at children with disabilities, learning disabilities. It's defined as having a minimum IQ level and a significant difficulty in a related school area. And so what happens, say you've got an IQ of 78 here, but in mathematics, your academic achievement is 60, on a standardized test. Well, that's going to be, that difference is surprising because your IQ is here, but you're performing way down here. So that's how a child is identified with a learning disability. Now, the text talks about dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and typically those are kind of more pop psychology terms. They're going to be diagnosed as learning disorder in writing, a learning disorder in reading, a learning disorder in mathematics. It's going to kind of go in that direction. They look at a couple of disorders, ADHD and autism. ADHD, you're probably familiar with that. That's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's 3 different groups. There is the inattentive type. There is the hyperactive impulsive type, and this is the one that usually drives the teachers just crazy because it's a kid who's paying attention, but they're moving around throughout the classroom. And then there's the combined type, and that's they're inattentive, they're impulsive, and they're hyperactive. And those are typically children that are going to have more challenges in school. We treat them, unfortunately, we use 90% of the world's Ritalin to treat our children. Probably the best one is medication, if necessary, plus behavioral interventions. Neurofeedback. The text will talk about it. It has been successful in some children, not so successful in others. It's a very expensive approach to it, but probably better than medication. There's also emotional behavioral disorders that kind of fall in this category. These are children that are so aggressive, or they're depressed, or they have fears. They would fall in this category as having a learning disability. Then there's autism spectrum disorder. Autism is an interesting and sad disorder. True children with autism are not that you have to be this way, but what we see let me just rephrase that, not true children, because Asperger's is truly autism, but severe autism are children that are nonverbal. So they're not communicating. They're not communicating with the world outside of themselves. They have atypical sensory responses. They have severe challenges, and some research is showing that they have problems with mirror neurons. So mirror neurons are things that if I take a drink of water and you see me drink that water, it's lighting up in my brain, but it's also lighting your brain. That's mirror neurons. Somebody smiles at you, it produces a dopamine reaction, and you smile back. For children with autism, those are challenges. They're not going to be able to understand those social cues. That dopamine that's released when somebody smiles at you is not typically released in a child with severe autism. And again, about 50% of children that are diagnosed with autism are nonverbal. Boys are 4 times more likely than girls to be diagnosed. A less severe one, although it's still under the same umbrella, it's not really a DSM-5 diagnosis because they just lumped them all together, is a thing called Asperger's disorder. And that is historically someone who is, many times they're quite verbal, but they lack those social nuances. I have some challenges with that. Educational issues, as we're going through this, prior to 1970, there wasn't any legislation for special education. It just occurred in different states, different counties, it was kind of ad hoc. 1975 was the first public law that addressed special education and mandated services for all children. And it's gone through different renditions as each president has gone in there. They kind of tweaked it a little bit. Cognitive changes. This is for Piaget. At the second half of the chapter, he says this is concrete operational stages. You remember, an operation is something that can be done mentally reversible action. And so at this stage, they're able to do that. So it goes from pre-operational to concrete operational. There's also information processing. What we find from that perspective is that they can become experts. That's why you see these child prodigies in chess. Now they may not be able to, they will, if you compared them, say an 8-year-old chess champion, to an adult, and they were learning a novel task, the adult's going to usually learn it faster and more thoroughly than a child. But with that said, the child at this age is going to be able to develop strategies to be successful. And so I personally think that's what schools should be emphasizing, is learning strategies of how to be successful academically, or just social interactions and so on. They're also able to develop critical thinking skills. Critical thinking is thinking in novel ways. Again, they can learn strategies for that. Brainstorming, don't over control, internal motivation are all factors there. Intelligence is addressed here as well with, let me go over here real quick here. First, intelligence is defined as a problem-solving skills and ability to learn from and adapt to life's everyday experiences. It started with Alfred Binet, Theodore Simon, and they were petitioned to study children that were orphaned in Paris. So there was a lot of children, and they wanted to find out which ones of them were educable. So they began to look at tasks that the typical 9-year-old can do, and typical 7-year-old can do, typical 11-year-old can do. And from that, they were able to kind of get an idea of where kids fell. Well, from there, William Stern came up with an IQ number. So he kind of quantified those tasks. And that brings us to Wechsler's scale, which is a scale that I use when I'm testing children to find out what is your IQ. What I always tell my parents that I work with too is that the IQ in and of itself is not so important as much as the things that make up that IQ score. For example, verbal intelligence, perceptual intelligence, that's kind of like your raw intelligence. Working memory, 1 + 1 is 2, + 3 is 5, and that type of thing. And then processing speed index, how fast they're able to do particular tasks. So that was the beginning of intelligence. Then they looked at types of intelligence and said, well, this may be maybe Eurocentric. And so Sternberg came up with his triarchic theories of intelligence. Says there's analytical, creative, and practical intelligence. He's also got a triarchic theory of love as well. Gardner's got his 8 frames of intelligence. And so it's developed so that we look at intelligence from a lot of different perspectives. Then they compare and contrast either extremes of intelligence. Intellectual developmental disorder, what was previously known as mental retardation. That's one side from it, this organic or cultural familial approach, to giftedness. That's where the text kind of divides those two up to get a better feel for the extremes of intelligence. And then the last thing almost the last thing that I emphasize is language development, reading being whole language and phonics. And what most of the research shows is that the best approach is combining the two of them. And then the last thing they talk about is bilingualism and second language learning. I'm a big proponent of it, but there are other people that said, you know what, it is a distraction for children that are having trouble with just one language. So there's a little bit of debate there. So with that said, guys, that introduces us to chapter 9. Hopefully you enjoy the chapter. It's an interesting chapter. I always like it, especially the things that really are kind of pet things that I enjoy is that bilingual education. All right, thank you so much, guys.